"You're safe," said
Everything
the
is going
lone
to be
rancher as
okay.
he saw an Apache woman
promise.
crying in the rain. The rain had started before dawn and showed no sign of stopping. It fell in long, steady sheets, turning the dry land of the open range into dark, sticky mud. Low clouds hung heavy over the hills, pressing the sky down until everything felt smaller and quieter than usual. Water ran through cracks in the earth that had been dry for months, filling shallow paths and making the ground dangerous for both horse and rider. The rancher rode slowly, his coat pulled tight around his shoulders. He had lived alone on this land for many years, long enough to know when to hurry and when to let the storm pass. Today, he had no choice. A broken fence line needed checking, and cattle scattered by thunder could wander too far if left alone. His horse moved carefully, hooves sinking into the soft ground with each step. The rancher was a man shaped by silence. He spoke little, even to himself. Out here, words often felt unnecessary. The land listened better than people ever had. His face was worn by sun and wind, his hands rough from work that never truly ended. He had once lived a life with more noise, more people, and more hope, but those days felt distant now, like a story he had heard long ago. As he followed the trail near a dry arroyo, now swollen with muddy water, something caught his eye. At first he thought it was a fallen branch or a dark rock moved by the rain. He almost rode past it, but then the shape shifted slightly, and he saw movement where there should have been none. He pulled the reins gently, bringing his horse to a stop. There, near the edge of the trail, was a woman. She was kneeling in the mud, her head bowed, long dark hair hanging wet against her face. Her shoulders shook, not from the cold alone, but from quiet sobs that the rain almost hid. Her clothes were torn and soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. One of her feet was bare, streaked with blood and mud. The rancher felt a tightness in his chest. Encounters like this were rare, and when they happened, they often ended badly for someone. He knew who she was the moment he saw her features and the patterns still visible on her clothing. She was Apache. Stories rushed through his mind, stories told in towns and camps, stories filled with fear and anger, most of them one-sided and cruel. He also knew the other stories, the ones spoken quietly by men who had seen things they could not forget. Stories of families forced to flee, of lives broken by decisions made far away. The woman lifted her head slightly, sensing his presence. Her eyes widened when she saw the horse and the man upon it. Fear flashed across her face. She tried to stand, but her legs failed her. She slipped back into the mud, catching herself with trembling hands. The rancher stayed where he was. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not speak. He knew sudden movement could turn fear into panic. The rain soaked them both as seconds passed, heavy and slow. He could turn away. That would be the safer choice. He had lived long enough to know that helping could bring trouble to his door, trouble he might not survive alone. No one would blame him if he rode on. In fact, many would expect it. But as he watched her struggle to steady her breathing, something stirred in him. It was not bravery and it was not foolishness. It was memory. He remembered another storm years ago and another moment when someone had looked at him with the same helpless fear. He remembered how the world had kept moving that day, uncaring and cold. He swung his leg over and dismounted slowly, keeping his movements open and calm. The horse shifted but remained steady. The woman flinched, raising her arms as if to protect herself. The rancher stopped a few steps away. He took off his coat, heavy with rain, and held it out in front of him, not stepping closer. "You're safe," he said. His voice sounded rough from disuse, but it was steady. The words felt strange on his tongue, like something he had not said in a very long time. The woman did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She stared at him, breathing hard, eyes searching his face for signs of danger. She did not reach for the coat, but she did not pull away either. Rainwater ran down his hair and into his eyes, but he did not wipe it away. He waited. After a long moment, her arms lowered slightly. Her shoulders sagged as if the strength to keep fighting had finally left her. She nodded once, very slowly. He placed the coat on the ground between them and stepped back. Only then did she reach for it, wrapping it around herself with shaking hands. The fabric was too large for her, but it was warm, and that mattered more than anything else. The rancher glanced at her feet and frowned. One was badly scraped, and she was limping badly. There was no way she could travel far like this, especially not in the rain. He gestured toward his horse, then toward the distant outline of his ranch, barely visible through the storm. He spoke slowly, using simple words, though he knew she might not understand them. "Shelter," he said. "Dry." She followed his gestures, her eyes moving from the horse to the land beyond. Uncertainty filled her expression. Trust did not come easily to someone who had lost so much. Another crack of thunder rolled across the sky, closer this time. The sound made her flinch again, and she pulled the coat tighter around herself. Finally, she nodded. Helping her onto the horse took time. She was weak and unsteady, and he was careful not to touch her more than necessary. When she was seated, he led the horse on foot, keeping a steady pace so she would not fall. They moved through the rain in silence. The rancher's thoughts were heavy as they walked. He wondered where she had come from, how long she had been alone, and what dangers she had escaped only to find herself here. He also wondered what dangers he might be inviting into his life by helping her. But beneath all of that was a simple truth he could not ignore. Leaving her, there would have been a choice he would carry for the rest of his life. As the ranch came into clearer view, a small, weathered cabin standing stubbornly against the storm, the woman lifted her head. For the first time since he had seen her, something like relief crossed her face. The rain continued to fall, washing the land clean, as if trying to erase the tracks of pain that had led her to that moment. Neither of them knew what would come next. But for now, she was no longer alone in the storm. The cabin door creaked as the rancher pushed it open, letting in a rush of cold air and rain. Inside, the space was small but solid, built from rough wood that had stood through many storms. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, its orange light flickering against the walls. The warmth reached out like a quiet promise. He guided the horse closer to the door and helped the woman down. She stumbled when her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her without thinking, then quickly stepped back to give her space. She clutched the coat around herself and looked around, taking in the room with careful eyes. He tied the horse and shut the door behind them, keeping the storm outside where it belonged. The sound of rain softened to a distant drumbeat on the roof. The woman stood near the doorway, unsure where to go. Water dripped from her hair onto the floor, forming a small dark pool. Her hands trembled, whether from cold or fear he could not tell. The rancher moved slowly, keeping his distance. He took a blanket from a hook on the wall and set it on a chair near the fire. He pointed to it, then to the flames. "Warm," he said gently. She hesitated, then took a few careful steps forward. When the heat touched her face, she let out a breath she had been holding for a long time. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sat, keeping her body turned slightly away from him, ready to move if needed. He nodded to himself and turned his attention to practical things. He hung his wet coat to dry and added a log to the fire. The flames brightened, filling the room with a steady glow. From a small shelf, he took a tin cup and poured water into a kettle. When it began to heat, he mixed in dried leaves and roots, something he had learned to do long ago when supplies were low. He set the cup on the table, then slid it across toward her, stopping it within her reach but not forcing it into her hands. She watched him closely, every movement. After a moment, she picked up the cup and took a cautious sip. The warmth spread through her, and she closed her eyes briefly, as if savoring the feeling of safety, even if she did not fully trust it yet. The rancher noticed her foot again, the one scraped and swollen. He pointed to it, then to a small wooden box under the table. She looked confused, but when he knelt and opened the box, taking out clean cloth and a small jar, Understanding dawned in her eyes. He held up the cloth, then gestured toward her foot, silently asking permission. She paused, then nodded once. He worked carefully, cleaning the wound and wrapping it gently. His hands were rough, but his touch was steady. She winced once, then relaxed, surprised by the care he showed. When he finished, he tied the cloth securely and leaned back. "There," he said softly. The word meant little to her, but the action meant everything. The night deepened, and the storm outside showed no sign of stopping. Wind rattled the windows and rain lashed against the walls. The cabin felt like a small island in a sea of darkness. They sat in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The rancher leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the flames. Memories surfaced uninvited. He thought of the life he had once planned, the people he had lost, and the choices that had led him to live alone on this land. He wondered how many storms a person could survive before they learned to stop fighting the rain. The woman shifted in her seat. She pulled the blanket tighter and glanced toward the door, then back at him. Slowly, she spoke a few words in her own language. Her voice was quiet but strong, carrying weight and meaning even if he did not understand it. He listened without interrupting. He did not need to know the words to feel the sorrow behind them. When she finished, she looked at him, waiting. He shook his head gently, a small smile touching his lips. "I don't understand," he admitted, "but I hear you." She studied his face, then nodded. Something in his honesty seemed to ease her tension. Hours passed like this, marked only by the fire growing low and the rain softening into a steady whisper. When the kettle was empty, he refilled it. When the fire dimmed, he fed it again. At one point, she leaned back and closed her eyes. Sleep took her slowly, cautiously, like an animal unsure if it was safe to rest. Her breathing evened out, and the lines of fear on her face softened. The rancher watched her from across the room. He felt a quiet ache in his chest, a mix of concern and responsibility. He knew that morning would bring questions and perhaps danger. Word traveled fast in these lands, and kindness was often mistaken for weakness. He rose and placed another blanket gently over her, careful not to wake her. Then he took his seat near the window, keeping watch. Outside, the storm finally began to fade. The rain slowed, leaving behind a deep, heavy silence. The land rested, soaked and dark, waiting for dawn. As the first pale light crept into the sky, the woman stirred. She opened her eyes and looked around, confusion flashing briefly before memory returned. She saw the blankets, the fire, and the man by the window. He turned when he noticed her awake. "Morning," he said quietly. She did not understand the word, but she understood the calm in his voice. She sat up slowly, testing her injured foot. It still hurt, but it was better than before. He poured fresh water into the kettle and set it to heat. The day ahead would not be easy. There would be decisions to make, paths to choose, and truths to face. But for now, the storm had passed and the cabin stood firm. Both of them knew that this shelter, this fragile peace, might not last forever. Still, in that quiet morning light, it was enough. Morning settled over the land with a soft, careful light. The storm had washed the dust from the air, leaving the sky pale and wide. Drops of water clung to the grass and the wooden fence, shining like small pieces of glass. The ranch felt different after the rain, quieter, as if it were holding its breath. The rancher stepped outside first, testing the ground with his boots. Mud still clung to the earth, but the worst of it had passed. He checked the fence line close to the cabin, then filled a bucket with water. When he returned, the woman was standing just inside the doorway, wrapped in the blanket, watching the world beyond the threshold. He did not rush her. He set the bucket down and nodded toward the small table. "Food," he said. He placed bread and dried fruit on a plate and stepped away. She approached slowly, like someone walking onto thin ice. She ate quietly, her eyes lifting now and then to watch him. He pretended not to notice, giving her the space she needed. After breakfast, he gestured toward a chair outside, one that sat in the sun. He pointed to her foot, then to the chair. "Sit," he said gently. She understood. She lowered herself carefully, stretching her injured foot forward. He knelt and checked the cloth he had wrapped the night before. It was still clean. He nodded in approval and replaced it, his movements calm and careful. She watched his hands closely. When he finished, she spoke a few words softly, her voice filled with meaning even if he could not understand it. He met her eyes and nodded, accepting the sound of gratitude in her tone. The day unfolded slowly. He went about his work, fixing a loose board, checking the animals, carrying supplies. She remained near the cabin at first, sitting quietly, watching everything. The land was open and wide, and it seemed to make her uneasy. There were too many directions to look, too many places danger could come from. As the sun climbed higher, she stood and began to help in small ways. She swept the floor, washed a cup, and carried light items he set aside for her. They did not speak much. Words were not needed yet. By the second day, she moved with a little more strength. Her foot still slowed her, but she did not complain. She followed him to the edge of the field, staying close but no longer afraid to step outside. When he worked, she watched and learned. When he struggled with a task, she offered help with a quiet gesture. At one point, she picked up a torn cloth from the ground and began to mend it using a small needle she had kept hidden in her clothing. Her hands moved with skill and care. The rancher watched from a distance, impressed by her focus and patience. He pointed to the cloth and smiled. "Good," he said. She looked up, surprised, then smiled faintly in return. That small moment changed something between them. Days passed, marked by sunlight and long shadows. The woman learned the shape of the ranch, the safe places and the open ones. She still startled at sudden sounds, and sometimes she would pause, listening to the wind as if it carried messages only she could hear. At night they shared meals by the fire. Sometimes she spoke quietly, telling stories in her language. He listened without interrupting. He did not ask questions he could not understand the answers to. He only offered his presence. Once she pointed to the hills in the distance and spoke with a tremble in her voice. Her hands shook slightly as she finished. He felt the weight of her words even without knowing them. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head, a silent sign of respect. He began to notice the strength beneath her tiredness. She rose early, helped where she could, and faced each day with quiet courage. She did not act like someone waiting to be saved. She acted like someone gathering herself, piece by piece. One afternoon, as they rested under the shade of a tree, she surprised him by speaking his language, just one word. "Thank you," she said slowly. The sound caught him off guard. He looked at her, unsure he had heard correctly. "You're welcome," he replied, smiling. She practiced the word again, careful with each sound. He nodded encouragement. In return, he asked her to teach him a word from her language. She considered this, then spoke a simple one, repeating it until he said it right. When he finally managed, she laughed softly, the sound light and warm. That laughter stayed with him long after it faded. Still, worry lived beneath the calm. He knew others might come riding through at any time. He knew that her presence could bring questions he could not easily answer. At night, he sometimes stayed awake longer than usual, listening for distant sounds. She noticed his unease. One evening, she pointed to the horizon and shook her head, then pointed to herself and made a walking motion with her fingers. He understood. She was telling him she would not stay forever. The thought left a strange ache in his chest. He nodded, though part of him wished she could remain longer. As the week ended, her strength returned more fully. She walked with less pain and more confidence. She helped prepare food and shared small skills from her own life, showing him how to store herbs and repair tools in ways he had not known. They were two people from different worlds, meeting in the quiet space between loss and survival. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, she stood beside him and looked out at the land. She spoke softly, her voice steady. He listened, understanding not the words but the choice behind them. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. He nodded, respecting her strength. The ranch would always be here, unchanged by their brief crossing of paths, but he knew that neither of them would leave this time untouched. The land stretched wide and open before them, holding both danger and promise. And in that shared silence, they prepared for the road ahead. The days that followed felt both calm and heavy. The air was clear now, and the land had dried enough for work to continue as usual. Yet something unseen rested between them, like a question neither had spoken aloud. They moved through their routines with care, aware that time was shaping their next steps. The woman rose early each morning. She washed her face at the water basin, tied her hair back, and stepped outside to greet the sun. The light touched her face gently, and for a moment she stood still, listening. Birds moved through the trees, and the wind carried the quiet sounds of the land waking up. She seemed to draw strength from these moments, as if reminding herself who she was. The rancher watched her from a distance. He admired the way she carried herself now, steadier than before. The fear that once lived in every movement had softened, replaced by calm alertness. He knew that change came from her own strength, not from the shelter he had offered. That understanding filled him with respect. They worked together more closely now. He trusted her with tasks that mattered, and she accepted them without question. She learned the rhythm of the ranch quickly. She knew when animals needed care and when the land needed rest. Sometimes she would stop and look toward the hills, her face thoughtful, as if measuring the distance between where she stood and where she needed to go. In the evenings, they shared quiet meals. The fire crackled softly, and shadows danced along the walls. Sometimes they spoke with words, sometimes only with looks and small gestures. Their conversations were simple, but they carried meaning. A nod could say thank you. A pause could say stay a little longer. One night, the rancher broke the silence. "You don't have to leave yet," he said gently. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were kind but firm. She shook her head slowly, then placed her hand over her heart. "I will go," she said in careful words. He nodded, understanding. He had known the answer before he asked. Still, hearing it made the quiet feel deeper. The next days were filled with small preparations. She gathered what little she owned, wrapping it carefully in cloth. He repaired a pair of worn shoes and set them aside for her. He filled a small pack with food and water, enough to last her several days. She watched him do this, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she touched the pack, then looked at him with gratitude in her eyes. "You help," she said softly. "I do," he replied. On the morning she planned to leave, the sky was pale and wide. The land stretched out before them, calm and open. They stood near the fence, neither rushing the moment. She took a step forward, then stopped. Turning back, she spoke quietly, her voice steady. He did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was thanking him not only for shelter, but for seeing her as a person, not a problem. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. "You were always strong," he said. "I just stood nearby." She smiled at that, a real smile, warm and full. Then she turned and began to walk. He watched her move across the land, her steps sure and purposeful. She did not look back. She did not need to. The path ahead belonged to her. As her figure grew smaller against the horizon, the rancher felt a quiet shift inside himself. He had lived many years believing that the past could not be touched, that mistakes could not be softened. Yet this brief crossing of lives had shown him something different. Kindness did not erase history, but it could change how one carried it. When she was gone from sight, he returned to his work. The ranch was the same as it had always been, but he was not. He moved with a lighter heart, knowing that one moment of compassion had mattered. That evening he sat by the fire alone. The flames burned steady and the wind whispered outside. He thought of the woman walking beneath the open sky, guided by her own strength. He hoped the land would be gentle to her. The night passed quietly. And when morning came, the rancher stepped outside and greeted the day with a new understanding. The land stretched on, wide and open, holding many stories. This was one he would never forget. The land felt quieter after she left. Not empty, just changed. The rancher noticed it in small ways at first. The cabin seemed larger, the morning slower. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor echoed longer than before. He moved through his days with the same habits, yet each step carried a new weight, as if the ground itself remembered what had passed. He rose before sunrise, as he always did. The sky was soft and pale, the kind of light that made the world feel honest. He brewed his drink, warmed his hands by the fire, and stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, sharp and clear. He stood for a long moment, looking toward the horizon where she had disappeared days earlier. He wondered how far she had gone by now. He hoped her foot had healed enough to carry her safely. He hoped the paths ahead were kind. Work waited, and he turned to it. He repaired a fence post, checked the water trough, and walked the line where the land dipped toward the hills. His body knew these tasks well. His hands moved without thought, but his mind wandered, returning again and again to the quiet strength in her eyes. As the sun climbed higher, he paused to rest under a tree. The shade was thin but enough. He sat and listened to the wind move through the leaves. In that sound he felt something close to peace. Days passed, then weeks. The routine of ranch life pulled him forward. There were animals to tend, supplies to manage, and weather to watch. Still, her presence lingered. He found the cup she had used, set carefully on the shelf. He found a small knot in a rope she had tied in a way he had never seen before. He did not undo it. Sometimes riders passed through the area, traveling between towns. They asked questions, as people always did. He answered simply. He spoke of rain, of land, of work. He did not speak of the woman. Not because he feared trouble, but because the story felt like it belonged to the land now, not to words. One evening, as the sun fell low and painted the sky with soft color, he sat by the fire and thought about his life before the ranch. He remembered the noise, the crowds, the sharp edges of the world he had left behind. He had chosen this quiet for a reason. He had believed it was the only way to live with what he carried. Now he wondered if quiet did not have to mean closed. The thought surprised him. He did not push it away. As autumn approached, the land shifted again. The air grew cooler and the days shortened. He prepared for the change, stacking wood and checking the roof. One afternoon, while walking the outer edge of his property, he noticed tracks along the trail. They were fresh. He followed them for a short distance, then stopped. The tracks did not come toward the ranch. They moved away, steady and sure. He smiled to himself, a small, private smile, and turned back. Winter came gently that year. Snow dusted the hills, and the world grew quiet under its cover. On long nights, he sat by the fire and thought of the many lives that crossed this land, each carrying their own story. He understood now that being alone did not mean being separate from those stories. When spring returned, it did so with bright green shoots and clear skies. The rancher felt stronger, lighter. He found himself humming while he worked, a habit he had not had in years. He welcomed travelers with a nod and a cup of water. He listened more than he spoke. One morning, while repairing a gate, he noticed something tied to the fence post. A small bundle of dried herbs wrapped carefully with a familiar knot. His breath caught. He held it in his hands, feeling the care in the binding. No note, no mark. None was needed. He stood there for a long time, letting the moment settle into him. The land was wide, and paths crossed and parted as they always had. Some connections did not need to last forever to matter. That evening, he placed the bundle near the hearth. The scent filled the cabin softly. He sat back in his chair and looked around the room. It was the same cabin, the same fire, the same walls, but it felt warmer now, as if something unseen had taken root. He understood then that safety was not only a place, it was a choice, a moment when fear did not win. Outside, the stars came out one by one, steady and bright. The rancher stepped out to look at them, breathing in the cool night air. Somewhere beyond the hills, a woman walked her own path, strong and free. He tipped his hat to the open sky, a quiet sign of respect. The land held them both, each in their own way, and that was enough.